Good morning. It is so good to be here with friends and family from California and Oklahoma. That's the story of my life, and it's the story of my family's life, so what more could I ask for? I already feel ministered to when Jennifer spoke so movingly about the difference between dispensing justice and also being transformed by justice. That was enough for me to think about for a long time. And then Rosemary's beautiful reflection and performance of the story, and her reminder and young Dashiell's reminder that when we have stories and they don't work for us, we have the right and perhaps the responsibility of changing those stories. So what a great illustration of that. And along these lines, I also want to say that last week, Luke Zimmerman preached a dynamo of a sermon about older brothers, younger brothers, being separated from each other, being reunited, and what's at stake for each of them. And I think I'm going to go back and listen to that sermon again. But wherever Luke is, like the old gospel song, he's somewhere listening for his name. I just want to give a shout out to Luke for that and say thank you. Thank you, Luke. I'm going to begin with a poem. This poem was written by William Clefcorn, a Midwestern poet from rural south central Kansas, German-American family. A person I used to hear a lot when I lived up in that part of the country reading. And I would say that this poem is a little atypical of the larger body of his work. It's about those, most of what he writes about is his formative years on the farm. And this poem is called My Granddaughter, Age 3, Tells Me the Story of the Wizard of Oz. Now, it might seem like this Craig Womack is stuck in that last series. Did anybody tell him that we're in a new series? But there's some ideas from what we were talking about back then that I would like to explore today. So my granddaughter, age 3, tells me the story of the Wizard of Oz. There's a brain, she says, right here, she says, pointing to the front of her head. But the scarecrow doesn't have it yet, not until the end of the story. And there's a heart, she says, right here, she says, pushing an index finger hard against her chest. But the Tin Man will not have it until the end of the story. And there's courage, she says, right here, she says, pushing a fist hard against her stomach. But the lion will not have it unless I tell the story. Shall I tell the story? Yes. I say, tell all of it, from beginning to end. And I am swept up with Dorothy and Toto, up and away to a place far removed from myself, to the truth, all over again, that nothing is true until told. Not the brain, not the heart, not courage, not even the witch who's the last to go. The teller now in complete control, her eye, the eye of all storms set straight at the end of the story. Unlike Rosemary, I didn't grow up hearing traditional Creek stories in the Creek language, but I heard a lot of stories, and a lot of them were about rural eastern Oklahoma, farming, working in the fields, picking cotton. My dad likes to tell about riding to Eufaula, Oklahoma, in a horse-drawn wagon on a bed full of cotton bolls, and watching in wonder and amazement as they pulled up to that chute at the cotton gin and watching that bed full of cotton slowly disappear from the wagon. My mom likes to tell about how she was too young to go out there and pick with people, so her job was to meet people at the end of the field row with a bucket of water and a dipper so people could get a drink. I certainly heard stories about the trip out to California, and one that always sticks out in my mind is about my great-granddad. And on one of these trips, they had so many people in the car that they kind of lost track of who all was traveling with them. And they pulled up to the fill-in station at Needles, California. My granddad got out to use the restroom or whatever he did, and they forgot him, and it was somewhere deep in the San Joaquin Valley that they remembered he was still back at the service station and had to turn around and go get him. If you've ever stood around at a gas station in Needles, California in the middle of the summer, you know that's not a lot of fun. I certainly heard stories about my family first finding work when they got here, and one of my granddads had worked in the oil fields in eastern Oklahoma and ended up becoming a pipe fitter for Standard Oil in the Bay Area. So these stories affected everything about me in terms of my personal identity, in terms of my vocation. I ended up being a professor and teaching literature, mostly in English departments, also in a Native American Studies department for 3 decades. And if anything, having heard all these stories created a certain kind of conflict in me in a way, because especially in the English department world, everybody, it would seem, did everything with a written text. And I became, and it wasn't just like if they presented at a conference, they would read this statement, or even if they did something as simple as introduce you to a job candidate, they would have something written out that they would read. And I became convinced fairly early on that, at least for me, in terms of the stories I knew growing up, that storytelling didn't happen inside a written text that was perfected and revised and brought to a point where when you read it, there was little chance you would ever make a mistake. And I began to think that stories came from quite the opposite direction. It was a place where you might mess up, where you might say something egregious, where you might offend somebody sometimes, where you might find yourself, as I did one time, sitting in the dean's office, and the dean says to me, "What in God's name were you thinking when you said that in front of your classroom?" And on that particular occasion, there probably wasn't a lot of thinking involved. I might be in a place where I'm speaking, and I forget everything I'm supposed to say. Rosemary might have to come up here and take over. And it's a space where I think that's where all the juice is. That's where the energy is. That's where the power is. It's a place where, on the one hand, as I just mentioned, you might say something and you think to yourself, that's the stupidest thing I've ever said. Maybe that's the stupidest thing anybody's ever said. But it's also a space of surprise and delight. My gosh, did that come out of me? That was really smart. I didn't know I knew that. And if we think about the poem just for a moment, the poem has a couple ideas in it that I think are familiar to us. This notion that our identities are intricately related to the stories we tell about ourselves, the stories we tell about our communities, even the stories that people tell about us. Another idea that I think we've probably heard before is this notion that even certain qualities or virtues, smarts, having a big heart, courage, has a relationship to our ability to articulate these things about ourselves. But notice what the poet says 4 times. That doesn't happen until the end of the story. Right? So what happens before the end of the story? What happens, I think, is a lot of the scary stuff. If you've watched The Wizard of Oz, you know there's some scary stuff. One of the things that's kind of funny about that film, I guess, in a twisted sort of way, is people forget what's in it. They perceive it to be a children's film. They show it to kids, and invariably, kids end up ducking and running for cover in terror, particularly during the flying monkey scenes. Yeah. Oh, I forgot that was in there. The flying monkeys, I think, were actually referenced in a sermon several weeks back. So I'm trying to draw a kind of parallel here that there's something about this vulnerability, this risk, this potential for fright, even perhaps a little bit of terror, that I think is kind of built into the oral tradition in a way that's a little bit different than writing. And to say once again, I think that's where all the juice is for me. And I would like to invite you to think about the unjust judge and the widow for a moment. the widow appears before the unjust judge, and she says, "Look, man, this guy is doing me dirt. I need you to intervene in this situation." And the judge just blows her off. She keeps coming back time and again, and to use the words from the NSV, she keeps bothering him. Well, think about this situation. The judge has all the power. The widow has little. He could do something really terrible to her. And yet, she deems it somehow worth it to take this risk in storytelling, to take this risk in language. She understands that her situation cannot change without taking that risk. There's a lot this parable doesn't tell us. Perhaps she had exhausted every other avenue of recourse before this. We don't know. But somehow she understands this, and we've all been there, right? I'm going to sound so stupid. I'm going to blather on and on about inconsequential stuff and never get to the stuff I meant to talk about. I'm going to offend somebody. They're not going to understand me. We've been there, but the story tells us that there are circumstances that cannot change until we take a certain kind of risk in language and in stories. So I would like to invite you all to take the storytelling challenge. Find a story that you can tell that comes from some other place besides a piece of paper or computer screen or your handheld gadget. Find one that comes from this place that has the capacity to surprise you, that embodies some of this vulnerability, and tell it. Yes, tell all of it from beginning to end. And see what happens. And I don't mean to present a kind of false ideal about all of this. I think many of us here were probably raised up in denominations where people told, they preached unscripted sermons at us, and in many cases they were just, pretty lousy. Right? So I'm trying to get us to aim towards the unscripted part, but not towards the unprepared part. If somebody would ever like to visit about ideas of how to put together these oral presentations, I would love to do that. I get this feeling that Luke might be pretty good at it as well. And I want to close with one idea. Last week during prayer time, I shared with you all the fact that I'm visiting with a cousin who's terminally ill. And we're trying to just tell stories and relive memories and talk to each other while we can still do that. And of course, as anybody would be, after those conversations, I'm reflective about the end of life, what that means, what happens when we're no longer physically present here, what is it that we become? And obviously, I don't have the ultimate answers to those kinds of questions, but here's one thing I do believe, that after we're gone, after we're no longer physically present, one of the things that we become is we become stories. We become stories that other people tell about us. Mado, thank you for your kind attention.
Hard act to follow, yeah. And we've been friends for so long that he knows all of my stories, and I would like to pick and choose which ones he remembers. We have heard the gospel reading and the interpretations that have been given both by Craig and by Jennifer, that she cried out, "My rights are being violated." She cried long enough to make the unjust judge change. And I like to think about Muskogee women who, when they go before the unjust judge, they usually invite them in to have a bit of fry bread, a bologna sandwich, maybe peanut butter. Sit down and let's talk this over. But as we know that some unjust judges are tone deaf and don't have good manners to sit down with a Muskogee woman and to be told, you're violating my rights. So we've heard the story. We've heard wonderful poem about being a good listener, God the listener. And we've talked about justice as a relational component. We talk to one another to find out what is justice for us. What is justice for the other that we need to companion on their journey to justice. We've heard about a rabbit who had his own ways about him until he met up with the wolf, and in order not to be devoured, they become friends. And then Craig's wonderful rendition of what happens to us in our storytelling and how we should let go of our notes. No. I'm at the stage where when I'm talking, I wander off into fields unknown and don't know how to get back to what was my point. But there are conflicts and struggles and fright that we don't always get to the end of our story easily. But the truths come from our sacred stories, whether they're from the parables about the realm of God, or whether they're about the generosity of sharing and becoming friends, whether our kinship relationships, the kingdom of God, we say, where we join together in our common struggle and how we seek justice for our common maladies and pain and suffering in order to learn how to live together in God's world. In God's realm, these stories give us an open alternative that surprises even us. Our stories prepare us to think through and act with courage. In my telling you my story, sometimes I get involved in a solution that's going to work for me. And you've been a good listener and a good support to me. That's the way of friendship, relational friendships. And so I invite us to join together in acts of courage and ways of being that call out for our crying for justice, not just in our behalf, but in behalf of others in our realm of God. To value relationships and friendships and learn to navigate and forge relationships that are healthy and whole, and to share our stories of hope and resilience, to encourage the resilience within each of us, so that we might share these with consistency and constancy, faithfulness to what we know to be truth in our stories. And so as we close our time together and being with you, let us all be on the same friendship level, respect for one another and respect for the ways we solve our conflicts and our struggles and share in the journey of life in the realm of God. Amen.